Thank you for joining us with Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. Joining us this week is a longtime friend of ours here at Heritage Mississauga, a volunteer extraordinaire, but a heritage professional and in the community, both within Mississauga, but more recently in Oakville. This is Elaine Eigl, who's been involved for many years with the Mississauga South Historical Society, but has donned a new hat and is volunteering with in connection with the Bronte Historical Society to create a cemetery tour of historic and fascinating Bronte Cemetery. And so Elaine, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Matthew. Great to be here.
So you have a long history with us of being the last person to sit down when they ask for volunteers, you find yourself exploring. I know it's become fascinating, but can you tell us a little bit about kind of how the cemetery tour came about? It's just a fascinating story. You had me out there for the first time. I've never been there before until a few weeks ago, and I have fallen in love with the area and the cemetery in particular. So how did the cemetery tour come about?
Well, like you, I was invited to research the property, and as soon as I set foot there, I fell in love too. It's one of those captivating spaces that you stumble across sometimes, or in our community that not many people know about. And I was one of those people. It was within my position as one of the heritage planners at the town of Oakville. And at that time, I was undertaking research into a number of cultural heritage landscapes or properties that were being investigated for their potential to be deemed cultural heritage landscapes. And Bronte Cemetery was one of those properties on the list that Oakville has been working through. And I was given the opportunity to investigate the cemetery. So it was in that role that I got to go and poke around and learn more about the residents, shall we say, of the cemetery, and fall in love with it. It is a very, very beautiful, bucolic, special place.
And a cemetery with a view. it's a stunning,
right?
Yeah.
You can't pay for that view. Well, no, I guess you could, but
really can't.
Not sure you want to.
So can you tell me just a little bit? So I'm going to guess that there's a lot of people on this show that, similar to like I was a few weeks ago, that didn't know a lot about the cemetery itself. I've certainly heard some stories and references to it, but it was the first time I had been there. And can you tell us a little bit about the history of the cemetery?
Sure. It's really not surprising more people don't know about it because it's tucked away. It's literally at the lake's edge. It was part of a parcel of land that Philip Sovereign was deeded or bought. I'm not quite sure. But Philip Sovereign came up to Upper Canada in early 19th century, and ended up in Trafalgar Township in 1812. So, of course, we all know 1812 is a very interesting year, and off Philip allegedly went to do his part for his newly adopted country to fight in the War of 1812. And after cessation of hostilities, he returned to his family, who he'd left behind here. And in 1814, he purchased 100 acres of property, of which the not quite 1 acre cemetery was part. Shortly thereafter, he sold, I'm not quite sure, have to do some more research. It was a rabbit hole I tried to avoid, but long story short, almost 1 acre was set aside for a burial ground. So it's through the Sovereign family that we now have this beautiful small cemetery right at the lake's edge.
And we have to also, there are sovereigns, of course, buried in the cemetery, but Bronte Historical Society is located in the nearby Sovereign House. So, I mean, hat tip and go visit the Bronte Historical Society, and we'll share some links to them as well. There's some unknowns with the cemetery. As you know, those are the great parts of a historic cemetery. Sometimes trying to figure out who and why did what. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, part of the cemetery was lost to erosion. There are few plans. There are no, or very few, I think, identified historic imagery of it. There's incomplete burial records. I mean, it must have been a challenge putting it together. Can you talk about some of the, I guess, some of the conundrums you've come across?
Sure. Of course, my go-to is usually looking for historic maps, historic plans, early documentation records. Usually there's information based on trustees who are taking care of the cemetery, and I wasn't able to find any of that. I had hoped to find an early, if not original, map of the cemetery, recognizing that an early 19th century map isn't impossible, but it's pretty rare. But unfortunately, there seems not to be a map of the cemetery, or there was, and it's just been lost at some point in the history. The other opportunity I thought where I may find some mapping was the early 1970s, I think 1971 inventory of the cemetery stones that was undertaken by the Ontario Genealogical Society. I understand sometimes when they were undertaking their inventories, they would also map out a cemetery. But again, with Bronte, it seems to have been the case that no plan was undertaken, no map was drawn. Erosion, yes, erosion's been a huge problem. We've lost anywhere between 70 and I think I heard somewhere 116 or 160 feet of property to the lake. So we know we've lost burials. There's a rather interesting image from a 1946 Toronto Star article showing remains that had been rearranged by children at the edge of the cemetery, and were subsequently very quickly reburied. So we know we have lost people to the lake. Photographs, I found one photograph taken from what looks like the road allowance, or maybe even to the edge of the cemetery. And just off in the distance in the far right corner, there may be a headstone, but that's about it. So historic imagery and plan and documentation was pretty thin on the ground. It may exist, but within the scope of the work that I was having to stick to, I wasn't able to do the research, to go down the rabbit hole, frankly, that I would love to go down. But at that point, that was not my focus.
Well, and we use this as a shout out. So if anybody's watching this program that has imagery, has and even plans or early burial registers or anything, or if you know somebody who's got a connection to this, you know, give a call out to them, get connected to the Bronte Historical Society, and let's you know, further document whatever we can on this fascinating story, this historic cemetery. So every cemetery, again, we know there's stories, and you've done you were gracious enough to share some of your research with us, or with me, when we took a tour there. Can you share just a couple of tidbits of the history that you've uncovered? Just, you know, whet our appetite a bit for the more stories that will follow.
It does. I probably looked at 1% of the headstones, maybe 5% of the headstones. And the stories that rolled out just from my research into those stones were very interesting, was fascinating. They were heartbreaking. They were, they spoke about our early history. They spoke about lives that were lived by a community very closely tied to the lake, where our experience, our contemporaneous experience of the lake right now, is fundamentally for leisure or pleasure. We go down to the lake to go boating, to walk along the edge, to maybe go to a beach and brave the very cold waters of Lake Ontario on a hot summer day. But the residents I was researching, they were living off of the lake. It was their main transportation route. It was where they would go and get dinner. It was where their livelihoods were made. And sadly, often it was also where they were buried. There are many stories of sailors lost to the lake. The Dorland brothers come to mind. They were lost in a gale in December 1st, 1886, which was written up in a local newspaper at the time. And they were both young men in their mid-20s, both leaving behind young families. One of the men's wives was actually pregnant with their child at the time. And it was early enough that I don't know if he knew he was about to be a dad. The other brother left behind a 20-month-old and his wife of 2.5 years. So that's very heart-rending. There are lots of infants in the cemetery. Again, something thankfully we don't really experience a lot of in our day and age. It's not unusual to see a parent's headstone with multiple headstones of their children dotted around them. They've predeceased them. And that was hard. There's also a lovely representation of Bronte's early Black settlers. And a funny story about them at the back of the cemetery. Although Oakville and area was known as end of the railway terminus, underground railway terminus, and were welcoming to the community. We know that members of the Black community talk about being buried at the back of the cemetery. And so it talks about a bit of segregation that sounds like may have happened. And again, from my very rudimentary research, that seems to be borne out, that a lot of the names that I've been able to associate with that community, largely through census records that do indicate Black or mulatto in the earlier days, and through family histories, they are at the back of the cemetery. So there's the Adams family is there. Samuel Adams, who invented or is credited with inventing the stone hooking rake, an implement used to pry stone off the lake bed. His family is there. He's alleged to be there, but there's no headstone and no burial record. So again, using land records and Ontario records, death registration, I wasn't able to confirm he is there or not, but there's so many stories, too many. I have to keep my talk short. It will be a challenge.
Well, I was going to say that history has a sense of irony too, because yes, we look at the stories of early Black settlers and they're buried at the back of the cemetery. But Mother Nature had something to say what happened to the front of the cemetery. So, the back is safe.
I did note that degree of irony too.
You're leading in right around the corner from us here in a couple of days, and then a few weeks later, you're leading a couple of guided tours of the cemetery. Can you tell us about the tours, when they are, and how do people take part?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be thrilled to. They are being put on by Bronte Historical Society, and there's information on their website on how to get in touch and purchase tickets. It is a fundraiser for the cemetery. This came about because recognizing I worked extensively with a couple of the people at the Historical Society during my research phase of my report. And we agreed that the stories that I uncovered or revitalized in many cases, it would be a shame just to have them in a report, that a corporate report through the town of Oakville that half a dozen or a dozen, maybe 24 sets of eyes would see. So the Historical Society and I thought, let's do the walking tour. And so I cherry-picked, with the town's blessing, I cherry-picked a few of the family histories that I'd written up on, and we're going to highlight some of those families and their stories, including the Dorland brothers and Samuel and Jeremiah Adams, and just try to bring to light some of the fascinating history that's just quietly sleeping there. So again, get in touch with Bronte Historical Society. Marianne Mason is the historian there. She's been such a great supporter of my work and would be happy to sell anyone a ticket to come on the tour. So,
and again, those tours are on July 9th and July 21st.
That's correct.
July 9th is, what time of the day is the one on July 9th?
We're Saturday, July 9th is the morning tour. It's 10 a.m.
10 a.m.
I'm aiming to keep it to about an hour, but depends on how many people come out, and hopefully lots do to share stories.
Yeah.
Wear your good solid walking shoes. It's a graveyard, so it's bumpy and uneven ground. And then the second, we've decided to make an evening tour to capture people who may not, or may be too busy or at a cottage on a Saturday morning in July. And that's Thursday, July the 21st at 7 p.m. So.
And the starting place is at the Sovereign House.
That's
then,
correct.
A short walk over to the cemetery.
Yeah, we're going to start at Charles Sovereign's house. We'll do a quick introduction, and it's a building in a location not to be missed. And to your point, it's about a 2.5 block walk away from the cemetery. So, and there's ample parking at the Sovereign House and not so much ample parking at the cemetery. So we thought a good chance to actually experience some of the neighborhood as well. Very beautiful community.
And we'll share links and address and all that kind of stuff here as well. And I shouldn't, I always find it fascinating making the Mississauga connections wherever we go, wherever we explore. And like any good story, there is a Mississauga connection here. Of course, the Dorlands, who we've talked about in the sense of tragedy, the Dorlands are very much connected to Port Credit, as well as Lem Dorland, a shipbuilder, and the trade of the stone hookers was very much tied the communities of Bronte, Oakville, and Port Credit together historically, and the families are all interconnected there. And of course, you have a few War of 1812 veterans buried in the cemetery, a couple who served with the 2nd Regiment of York Militia, which is also historically the unit that people from historic Mississauga served in as well. And so you have those connections, and there's certainly others as well, but well worth a visit. What a charming location. What a truly, I don't know what the right word is here, but respectful, quiet, peaceful cemetery with an incredible location. And you feel like you're walking in the footsteps of the past when you go down there. And part of the intrigue is, again, that story of the erosion of the cemetery, and just how the landscape has changed over time from what those that came and lived and died so long ago, what they would have known is different than what we see today. But I marvel at the location, and thank you for the work that you're doing. It's quite an amazing venture that you're on, and hopefully we get some people turning out, sharing their stories, and exploring this wonderful piece of history with us. So Elaine, thank you. I hope there's a Mississauga Cemetery tour in your future as well. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But thank you for all that you've done with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and thank you for the time. You're right. I hope we get lots of people coming out and sharing stories and telling me I'm wrong. But did I know? Because there's always room to learn more when you're a historian. So.
It's a fascinating thing when you can give voices to the departed and share their stories. But it's also a neat way for us to learn more about our history collectively. Like we're storytellers, but they were the authors, right? Like that's the challenge. I've always referred to, I talk to people about gravestones. I call them the cheat sheets of history. If you look at a gravestone, you can actually learn quite a bit about the person just through the names, the dates, sometimes the sayings or the symbols that are therein, but put them in the context of their times and try to that's the starting place. You can learn a lot just by perusing a cemetery of a community, of kind of how they express themselves and how they connected to their neighbors, and of course intermarriages. You can connect families that are in the cemetery with each other, and it's putting voices to the past is fascinating, and hopefully people bring forward more voices. So
Agreed.
Anyway, with that, again, Elaine, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining us here on Ask a Historian. Again, each and every week, send in your questions and we'll explore stories of the city of Mississauga and beyond, including Bronte, with you each week here at Ask a Historian. And remember to like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. And with that, we will see you next week with Ask a Historian.